mouth, and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. When I saw that our closing hymn today is sung to the tune Finlandia, I had an instant flashback to the summer I spent in Finland as an AFS high school student. Back then, I learned a verse of a song in Finnish, which praised the blue and white of the country's beautiful landscape. I came home from that summer experience with a bit of Finland forever embedded in my soul, and with a love for travel, which Tom and I have been fortunate to share throughout our marriage. In May, we spent a few days in Bogota and Medellin, Colombia, where we had a wonderful guide named Diego. Today's hymn has the words, "My home, the country where my heart is." Diego embodied that spirit. Although he had worked here in the US for a time, he ultimately returned to Bogota and to a job he obviously loved, which was sharing his thriving city and beautiful country with visitors like us. He talked about the decades of internal violence Colombians have suffered and the peace agreement between the government and warring factions. And he spoke with hope and pride of Colombia's progress in becoming a better, safer place for its people to live. We may remember the 1980s and 90s when the name Medellin met a powerful drug cartel and the violent deaths of thousands of people. Diego took our small group to ride a commuter cable car up the steep slope of a mountainside neighborhood known as Comuna 13. This area was once the most dangerous neighborhood in the city, with rival gangs shooting at each other from hillside trenches. Now, the immaculately maintained cable car means that residents can commute to jobs in minutes instead of hours. Diego introduced us to Joaquin Calle. In 1987, a massive landslide destroyed one of Medellin's poor hillside communities in the area. Joaquin's parents both died in the disaster. As a bereft young man, he turned to drugs and violence. Then he turned his life around and founded the Corporación Campo Santo. That group created a memorial for the victims and survivors of the landslide and started environmental projects. We visited the recycling center that Joaquin and his people created in the former gang war trenches. It was a rustic structure piled with neighborhood trash, but it boasted a recently acquired machine for compressing plastic bottles into bales, which they sell to processing companies. We walked into a lush community garden to an environment classroom where children learn and then teach their families about recycling, which is now widespread in the neighborhood. Joaquin himself, now 38, is finishing a university degree in civil engineering. Now, while it may not look that impressive, this one man's project has helped to change his neighborhood, creating jobs, a sense of pride, and a better environment. I thought of Joaquin and Comuna 13 as I read today's text. Metaphorically, Medellin and this particular neighborhood are returning from a long exile of violence and isolation. Joaquin's project is in effect giving a cup of water to the little ones, ministering to those historically at the bottom of Colombian society. Although every big city has its problems, We were visiting a thriving working class neighborhood with streets decorated with murals on the buildings, full of school children, small shops, a group of women having coffee on a door stoop, men doing house repairs. Our upcoming 4th of July celebrations make me think of community. During the years we lived in Corning, New York, the whole town would gather on the banks of the Chemung River to watch the annual fireworks display over the water. Maybe you remember parades and rodeos and family picnics. Our recent time in Colombia put flesh on the words of today's hymn. This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart is. But other hearts in other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. July 4th is when we celebrate our love for our country and our pride in being Americans. We remember our history and the brave men who risked everything their own and their very lives to sign a piece of paper known as the Declaration of Independence. The 4th is also a time to consider what kind of country we want to continue to be, and to think about how we as Christians contribute to that ideal by the way we live and act. We are a pluralistic society which has no established state religion, but which guarantees us the right to worship freely. Today's gospel reading from Matthew is short but instructive. It comes at the end of a whole section where Jesus is calling, instructing, and sending out his disciples. Their job, and our job, is to share the everyday presence of Christ, even in the smallest ways, like giving a cup of water to a thirsty person who needs it. Even by such a seemingly small gesture, the giver responds to human need. The living Christ comes through in the recognition of human dignity, which, by the way, we promise to support in our baptismal vows. The so-called little ones can be seen as the poor, the scorned, and the outsiders, those who may experience prejudice and injustice. Jesus tells us to welcome them in his name. He reminds us of the worth of every single person as a creature of God and directs us to true compassion and care for the people all around us. This little text got echoed in today's opening hymn, which urges us to hear Christ's voice above the cries of race and clan, above the noise of selfish strife. We listen for Christ's voice to guide us as we interact with others and as we carry out our responsibilities as citizens of our nation and the world. As we love our country, we recognize the divisions in our political landscape, the needs and tensions in our public life. Can we hear the voice of Christ through the clamor of competing voices and the cries of money and power? I love our St. John's motto, where tradition meets diversity. As a Christian community, we live out our motto and the gospel itself by fostering a diverse and welcoming worshiping congregation. We offer that metaphorical cup of water, for instance, through our ministries with William Temple House and Western Farm Workers. As we celebrate this year's 4th of July, we give thanks for our country and for our many blessings as Americans. And we remember that the people of other nations love their countries too. People everywhere have needs and dreams. All countries belong to God. As Christians, as disciples, Each one of us is called to pray, to love, to work for God's kingdom from the corner of whatever neighborhood we live, in whatever way we can. The hymn closes with words, "O hear my prayer, thou God of all the nations. Myself I give thee, let thy will be done." To paraphrase the Jesus of Matthew's gospel, this is a large work I've called you into, but don't be overwhelmed by it. Give a cool cup of water to someone who is thirsty, for instance. The smallest act of giving or receiving makes you a true apprentice. You won't lose out on a thing.